The young man arrived at his grandfather's grave after his late grandmother revealed a great secret buried beneath it. As he lifted the cover of the underground chamber, the sight before him left him shocked, unable to utter a single word. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, mingling with the fading fragrance of funeral lilies. Daniel stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the polished mahogany casket as it was lowered into the ground. The priest's voice droned on, offering words of comfort and eternal peace, but they barely registered in his mind. His grandmother, his only true family, was gone, and no amount of prayers or condolences could fill the emptiness she left behind. As the final handfuls of dirt fell onto the casket, a dull, hollow sound echoed through the cemetery. People around him whispered their sympathies, some placing gentle hands on his shoulder before retreating. He nodded absently, murmuring his thanks, though he hardly knew who he was thanking. The weight of grief pressed against his chest, heavier than he had anticipated. When most of the mourners had begun making their way toward their cars, Daniel remained rooted to the spot. He wasn't ready to leave yet. Not when it felt like stepping away meant accepting that she was truly gone. His grandmother had been everything, his guide, his protector, the one person who had never abandoned him, even when life had been unkind. Without her, the world felt unsettlingly unfamiliar. Just as he exhaled, willing himself to turn away, a figure appeared in his peripheral vision. An older woman stood a few feet away, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. She was dressed simply, a dark blue coat buttoned up to her chin, a knitted scarf wrapped neatly around her neck. Though he was certain he had never seen her before, there was something strikingly familiar about her presence. She stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate. Daniel. Her voice was soft, yet firm, the kind that held quiet authority without demanding attention. He blinked, pulling himself out of his thoughts. Do I know you? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and retrieved an envelope, aged, slightly yellowed at the edges. The handwriting on the front, though faded, was unmistakable. His heart lurched as he recognized it. "She wanted you to have this," the woman said, placing the envelope into his open palm. Her fingers were cool against his skin, her grip gentle but certain. Daniel swallowed, staring at the familiar loops and curves of his grandmother's handwriting. His breath felt tight in his chest, like the weight of the moment was pressing down on him all at once. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The woman offered a small, knowing smile. "A friend," she said simply. "Of hers. And now, of yours." Before he could form another question, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing beyond the wrought-iron gates of the cemetery. Daniel remained still, his fingers tightening around the envelope as a breeze stirred the loose leaves at his feet. With measured breath, he carefully slid his thumb under the seal and tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore his grandmother's neat, deliberate script. "My dear Daniel, if you are reading this, then I am gone. But there is something I need to tell you, something I have kept hidden for a long time. You must go to your grandfather's grave. Beneath it lies a secret, one that has been waiting for you, and you alone. Trust me, my love. Trust what I have left for you. And most of all, trust yourself. With all my heart, grandmother." Daniel's pulse quickened as he read the words again, as if the meaning would shift into something more rational the second time around. But it didn't. A secret beneath his grandfather's grave? He had visited that grave countless times over the years, yet never once had he imagined there was anything more to it than a slab of stone, and the memories it carried. His grandmother had never spoken of it, never hinted at anything unusual. And yet, here it was, written in her own hand, her words filled with an urgency he couldn't ignore. The heaviness of grief was momentarily replaced by something else. Something unsettling, something unexplainable. A quiet but insistent pull at the back of his mind. Daniel couldn't shake the weight of the letter. He carried it with him everywhere, folded in his pocket, resting on his nightstand, tucked inside the pages of an old book he knew he wouldn't read. No matter where he placed it, his eyes always found their way back to it, drawn to the inked words as if they might change when he wasn't looking. The message was simple, but its implications ran deep. His grandmother had never been one for riddles, never indulged in tales of hidden fortunes or cryptic secrets. And yet, she had written those words with certainty, as if she had known this moment would come, as if she had known he would hesitate but ultimately find himself unable to ignore them. For 4 days, he resisted. On the 5th, he gave in. It was past midnight when he drove to the cemetery, the air thick with the scent of rain that had passed earlier in the evening. The wrought iron gates stood open, a quiet invitation, though the place had long since emptied of visitors. As he stepped onto the damp grass, he felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, but he pushed forward, gripping the handle of the shovel he had brought with both hands. His grandfather's grave sat beneath the familiar shade of an old oak tree, its branches stretching wide, casting twisted shadows under the moonlight. He had been here countless times before, spoken into the quiet, let his fingers trace the engraved letters on the stone. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't here to mourn. He was here to unearth something long buried. The first thrust of the shovel into the earth sent a jolt through his arms, but he ignored it, setting into a rhythm, letting the motion consume his thoughts. The damp soil gave way easily at first, but the deeper he dug, the heavier it became, the weight of it pressing against his muscles, demanding more effort, more resolve. He lost track of time, aware only of the sound of metal scraping against dirt, the way sweat gathered at the nape of his neck despite the cool night air. And then, something changed. The shovel struck something solid, not rock, not a root, but something else, something unnatural beneath the layers of earth. His breath hitched, and he crouched down, brushing the loose dirt aside with his hands. A metallic surface gleamed under the flashlight beam, rusted but sturdy, its edges disappearing beneath the remaining soil. A hatch. He stared at it for a long moment, fingers hovering just above the surface. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he truly understood their weight. This wasn't just a sentimental secret she had left behind. This was something tangible, something deliberate. His pulse pounded in his ears as he searched for the latch, his hands trembling slightly as he pried it open. The metal groaned in protest, but after a few forceful tugs, it gave way, revealing a dark passage below. A rush of stale air rose to meet him, thick with age, carrying a scent of damp stone and something he couldn't quite name. He hesitated, gripping the edges of the opening, his flashlight casting a weak glow into the depths. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of the light. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to pretend he had never found this place. But his body moved before he could think better of it. He took the first step, then another, his grip tightening on the flashlight as he descended. The air grew colder with each step, the silence pressing against his ears, wrapping around him like a living thing. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber, its walls lined with rough stone, the floor uneven beneath his feet. Dust clung to the air, stirred by his presence, settling onto the objects that filled the space. Shelves lined the walls, their wooden frames worn but sturdy, holding stacks of books, old ledgers, small locked chests whose contents remained a mystery. But his eyes were drawn to the center of the room, to the neat rows of bundled money, the scattered gold coins, the glint of something precious long forgotten. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the discovery settling over him. This was more than an inheritance, more than a family secret. This was something his grandmother had protected, something she had chosen to leave for him. And now, standing in the dim glow of his flashlight, he was left with the one question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The silence in the underground chamber was heavy, pressing against Daniel's chest like an unseen weight. He sat on the cold stone floor, the dim beam of his flashlight casting long shadows across the stacks of money and scattered gold before him. The air smelled of age, dust, damp stone, and something else. Something intangible, like the echoes of time itself lingering in the stillness. His grandmother had left this for him. That much was clear. But why? He reached out, his fingers skimming over the edges of the burlap sacks piled in front of him. The rough fabric was stiff with age, but the contents inside were unmistakable. Bundles of crisp, untouched bills, stacked with precision. He could feel the weight of them even without lifting a single one. There was more money here than he had ever seen in his life, more than he had ever imagined he would have. For a long while, he just stared, his mind unraveling under the sheer enormity of it. What was he supposed to do now? His entire life had been a struggle, scraping by, taking odd jobs, trying and failing to start a business, drowning in debts that had felt insurmountable. He had learned to live with disappointment, to expect failure as the natural order of things. And now, sitting before him, was the kind of wealth that could erase every hardship he had ever known. A life without worry. A life where every door that had once been locked to him could now swing wide open. It would be so easy. The thought lingered, curling around him like a temptation he didn't want to acknowledge. He could take the money, leave this place behind, start over somewhere new, become someone new. No more bills piling up. No more looking at price tags before deciding if he could afford something. No more feeling like the world was built for everyone except him. But then, just as quickly as the thought took root, something else crept in. A memory. His grandmother's voice, gentle but firm, warning him in her letter. Don't hoard it, Daniel. Don't let it consume you. His throat tightened, his grip on the flashlight growing tense. He could still picture her, sitting in her old rocking chair by the window, watching the world outside with that quiet knowing in her eyes. She had always been a woman of wisdom, of kindness. She had never been rich, not in the way people measured wealth, but she had never let that stop her from helping others. And now, she was asking him to do the same. Daniel let out a slow breath, dragging a hand down his face. The weight of the decision pressed against his ribs, heavier than anything he had ever faced. If he kept it all, no one would ever know. He could justify it, argue that he had spent his whole life struggling, that he deserved a break, that she had left it for him, after all. But deep down, he already knew that wasn't the kind of man he wanted to be. He thought of the people out there, the ones he had passed on the street, the ones who barely scraped by, the ones who had dreams just as he did but no means to chase them. He thought of the children whose parents couldn't afford to send them to school, the families who went to bed hungry, the elderly who had no one to care for them. And then he thought of his grandmother again. She had given him everything she could, even when she had nothing. How could he do any less? The answer settled inside him, solid and certain. With a deep inhale, Daniel pushed himself to his feet, dusting off his hands. The money could change his life, yes. But more than that, it could change other lives. And that was what truly mattered. The decision sat deep in Daniel's chest, steady and unwavering. For the first time since finding the money, he felt no conflict, no hesitation, only clarity. The weight of the choice had lifted, replaced by a quiet certainty. This wasn't just about what he could do with the money, it was about what he should do. He spent the next few days in solitude, sketching out plans in his mind, considering the best way to honor his grandmother's wishes. The money, stacked neatly in burlap sacks, was no longer just a pile of bills. It was a chance to lift others the way his grandmother had always tried to, despite having so little herself. The first call he made was to an old acquaintance, a man who had dedicated his life to education reform in struggling communities. Daniel hadn't spoken to him in years, but when he explained what he wanted to do, setting up scholarships for underprivileged children, the man's voice cracked with emotion. "These kids," he had said, his voice thick with gratitude, "they've got the minds, the drive, but no way out. You have no idea what this could mean for them." But Daniel did know. He thought of all the times in his own life when doors had been shut in his face, not because he lacked the ability, but because he lacked the means. If this money could open even a few of those doors for someone else, then it was already worth more than anything he could have used it for himself. From there, the work snowballed. He sought out grassroots charities, the ones that didn't have flashy marketing campaigns but made real change in their communities. He met with shelter directors, hospital administrators, struggling single parents, anyone who could help him understand where the money would do the most good. At a rundown community center on the south side of town, he sat across from a woman who had spent the last 20 years helping the homeless. She spoke with the weary voice of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to give up. "You want to know the worst part?" she asked, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "It ain't just that people don't have homes. It's that they stop feeling like people. The world looks at them like they're not even there." Daniel nodded, absorbing her words. He had walked past those people before, men huddled beneath blankets in alleyways, women clutching children with hollow eyes, teenagers with nowhere to go. He had seen them, but he hadn't seen them. That night, he wrote a check big enough to fund an expansion for the shelter, to make room for those who had been turned away too many times. It was the first of many. Somewhere along the way, he realized something unexpected. He was changing too. The work consumed him, but not in the way money had once occupied his thoughts. Back then, it had always been about scarcity, what he didn't have, what he couldn't afford, what he would never reach. But now, he saw the world through a different lens. It wasn't about wealth or lack of it. It was about opportunity, about how the right help at the right moment could turn a person's entire life around. And yet, no matter how much he gave, there was always more need. No amount of money could fix everything, and that truth settled heavily on his shoulders. But then, one evening, as he stood outside a newly opened homeless shelter, one he had funded, a little girl ran up to him, her mother trailing behind, with tears in her eyes. She tugged at his sleeve, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you the man who brought the beds?" Daniel crouched down, smiling softly. "I guess you could say that." She grinned. missing one of her front teeth. "Mama says I don't have to sleep in the car no more." The woman behind her clutched her coat tight, as if holding herself together. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Daniel swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. He had spent so much time thinking about the money, how to use it, how much to give, where it should go. But here, now, in the glow of the streetlights, it wasn't about numbers on a check. It was about this. A child who would sleep in a warm bed tonight. A mother who could breathe again. He nodded, offering the woman a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to." As they walked away, he stayed where he was, watching them disappear into the shelter, into a place where hope had been restored. His grandmother had been right all along. Wealth wasn't about what you kept. It was about what you shared. Days passed in a quiet rhythm, marked only by the steady work Daniel had immersed himself in. His time was no longer his own. It belonged to the children receiving scholarships, to the families finding shelter, to the sick, who now had a chance at treatment they once thought impossible. He had given up counting how much he had donated. The numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the change unfolding before him. But one afternoon, as he sorted through a stack of letters that had piled up at his doorstep, some from charities, some from grateful recipients, his fingers stilled on an envelope that felt different from the rest. It was handwritten, and the ink slightly smudged, as if the person writing had hesitated, rewritten, reconsidered. The name on the corner read, Clara Whitmore. It wasn't familiar to him, but as he slid his finger under the seal and unfolded the paper, he realized she was familiar with him. "Dear Mr. Ellis, I wasn't sure how to begin this letter, or if I should even write it at all. But some things need to be said, and gratitude is one of them. I run the Whitmore Foundation, a small charity focused on helping single mothers rebuild their lives. Last month we were close to shutting down. The funding had dried up, the waiting list for assistance was growing longer, and I had begun to wonder if maybe our efforts weren't enough. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, we received an anonymous donation large enough to keep us going for years to come. I searched for the name behind it, but there was none. No press releases, no recognition, just quiet generosity. But I found you, eventually. It wasn't difficult. You've left a trail of hope behind you, Mr. Ellis, even if you never meant to be found. And I wanted you to know that your kindness isn't just numbers on a ledger. It's lives changed. It's mothers who can sleep at night, knowing their children are safe. It's young girls who now have the chance to dream of something bigger than survival. I hope one day we can meet. I'd like to shake the hand of the man who reminded me why I started this work in the first place. With deepest gratitude, Clara Whitmore. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time, his pulse steady but deep, like a river running beneath the surface of his skin. Over the past few months he had received countless letters, thank yous, testimonials, words of appreciation. But none of them had unsettled him like this. There was something in Clara's words, something beyond gratitude. It was understanding. He folded the letter carefully, placing it on the table beside him. But even as he tried to turn his mind to other things, it lingered. A question, a pull. He had spent so long giving to people he would never meet, helping from a distance, keeping himself hidden in the shadows of anonymity. But Clara had found him. And more than that, she wanted to meet him. He should let it go. He had done what he set out to do. The money was working, changing lives, making a difference. That was all that mattered. And yet, that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the quiet hours before dawn, he felt the weight of something unresolved pressing into his chest. Then came the dream. It wasn't the first time he had dreamed of his grandmother since she passed. Sometimes she appeared in flickers, a memory, a smell, a whisper of laughter in a room that should have been silent. But this was different. This was her. She sat across from him at the worn kitchen table where she had spent so many years mending clothes and peeling apples and telling him stories about a world she had never seen but imagined so vividly. The light from the window cast soft lines across her face, making her look younger than he remembered, though her eyes held the same quiet wisdom. She reached across the table, placing a warm, familiar hand over his. "Daniel," she said gently, as if she had been waiting for him to listen. "You're not done yet." He swallowed, his throat thick. "I've done everything you asked. The money's gone to the right places. It's helped people." She smiled, not in reprimand, not in disagreement, but with the kind of patience that had always unsettled him, because it meant she already knew something he didn't. "I didn't just leave you money, sweetheart. I left you a path." She squeezed his hand, her touch light but firm. "But some paths, you can't walk alone." The words lingered as she pulled back, her figure softening at the edges, the way dreams often do before they slip away. When Daniel woke, the early light creeping through his curtains, he knew. He couldn't ignore it. He had to meet Clara. Daniel hesitated before dialing the number written neatly at the bottom of Clara's letter. He had read it so many times that the ink had begun to fade in places where his fingers had pressed too firmly, as if he had been trying to pull meaning from between the lines. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the idea of meeting her, or the feeling that in some strange, inexplicable way, he already knew her. The phone rang twice before a warm, steady voice answered. There was no hesitation in her tone, no guarded politeness. She spoke as if she had been expecting his call, as if his voice on the other end of the line was a certainty rather than a possibility. 2 days later, he found himself outside a modest brick building, the words Whitmore Foundation engraved on a plaque by the entrance. He took a slow breath before stepping inside, feeling the weight of something more than nerves pressing against his ribs. The air inside smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a mix of paper and warm. The walls were lined with framed photographs, children laughing, families embracing, moments of quiet gratitude captured in still images. It wasn't an office in the traditional sense. It felt lived in, like a space where real work happened, where hope was built from the ground up. A door at the far end opened, and then she was there. Clara Whitmore. She wasn't what he had pictured, though he wasn't sure he had formed any real image of her in his mind. She was younger than he expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped seeking approval. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Sharp, observant, filled with the kind of kindness that wasn't just felt, but understood. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and though they had never met before, there was something in the silence between them that felt familiar, like an unfinished conversation waiting to be continued. She was the first to speak. "Daniel Ellis." A small smile played at the corners of her lips. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure you'd call." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Neither was I." She motioned toward the worn leather chairs in the center of the room, and they sat across from each other, a wooden desk between them. The first few minutes were careful, measured, two people learning the rhythm of a conversation that neither had prepared for. But as the minutes passed, The caution faded. Daniel found himself speaking more than he expected, sharing pieces of himself he hadn't planned to. He told her about his grandmother, about the letter, about the night he unearthed the hidden room beneath his grandfather's grave. He spoke of the weight of that discovery, of the choice that had nearly consumed him, of the moment he realized that wealth meant nothing unless it was given away. And Clara listened, not just with polite interest, but with the kind of attentiveness that made him feel as though his words mattered. She didn't interrupt, didn't fill the spaces between his sentences with empty acknowledgements. She simply let him speak, absorbing the story as if it were a puzzle she had been waiting to put together. When he finally paused, she leaned back slightly, studying him. I read once that real generosity isn't about giving what's easy to give. It's about giving what costs you something. Daniel considered that. Then I suppose I've spent most of my life giving nothing at all. Her gaze didn't waver. And now? He exhaled slowly, the weight of the past months settling over him. Now, I want to do more. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression. Then, with the ease of someone who had spent her life turning conversations into action, she stood. Come with me. Daniel hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he rose, following her as she led him through the back entrance and into a world he had only ever seen from a distance. They spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the city, through places Daniel had never taken the time to notice before. She took him to the shelter his money had helped expand, to a community kitchen where volunteers greeted Clara like family, to a makeshift classroom where children sat on mismatched chairs, their laughter filling the space between broken walls. Everywhere they went, people knew her, not as a benefactor, but as someone who showed up, someone who stayed. Daniel had given money, but Clara had given time. And standing beside her, watching as she knelt to talk to a little girl clutching a battered stuffed bear, he realized something else. This wasn't just about charity. This was about connection. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel wanted to stay. The days that followed blended into something steady, something real. Daniel and Clara moved through the city together, visiting shelters, speaking with struggling families, listening to the quiet voices of people who had been forgotten by the world. It was one thing to write a check, to fund a cause, but it was another entirely to be there. To see the gratitude in a mother's eyes when she held the keys to her first real home, to hear the laughter of children who had once known only hunger. At first, Daniel had watched from the edges, unsure of where he fit in. But over time, something shifted. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He sat with the elderly in community centers, let children pull him by the hand as they showed him their drawings, stayed up late reviewing financial reports to make sure every cent of the donations was accounted for. He wasn't just giving money, he was giving himself. And Clara noticed. In the beginning, she had admired him as a benefactor, someone with the means and heart to make a difference. But the more she saw, the more she understood. He wasn't just here to ease his conscience or fulfill some obligation left behind by his grandmother. He was here because he believed in what they were doing, because he cared, not just in the way people cared about causes from a distance, but in the way that changed a person, in the way that made them stay. One afternoon, as they visited an orphanage in the poorer part of town, Clara watched him from a few steps away. He was kneeling beside a little boy, listening intently as the child described a superhero he had imagined. There was something about the way Daniel listened, not just nodding along absent-mindedly, but truly hearing him, as if no one else in the world mattered in that moment. And something stirred inside her. For years, Clara had built her life around this work, around helping others, around making sure she never let anyone down. She had spent so much time giving that she had forgotten what it felt like to receive, to be on the other end of kindness, to feel supported, to be seen. Daniel saw her. She had felt it in small moments, the way he would glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking, the quiet concern in his voice when he told her to get some rest, the way his presence always seemed to steady her, when everything else felt too heavy. But neither of them spoke about it. Daniel hesitated because he feared breaking something fragile, something that had been built so carefully between them. He told himself that what they had was enough, that working side by side, sharing the same purpose, was all he needed. He told himself that admitting anything more would risk losing what had become the most meaningful connection of his life. And Clara hesitated because she had convinced herself for so long that love was something that had to wait. There was always another problem to solve, another person to help, another fire to put out. She had learned to push aside her own needs, to bury them beneath responsibility. But when she was with Daniel, she couldn't bury anything. She wasn't just Clara, the director of a foundation. She was Clara, the woman who laughed too loudly when he made an unexpected joke, the woman who found herself waiting just a little longer at the end of each day so she could say goodnight to him one more time. But then, everything changed. A news report surfaced, claiming that one of their biggest projects had mishandled funds. It was a lie, fabricated by a competitor trying to discredit them, but the damage was immediate. Headlines spread quickly, donors hesitated, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt powerless. This foundation was her life. Every hour, every decision, every sleepless night had been poured into making sure people had what they needed. And now, all of it was being questioned. Daniel saw the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she clenched her jaw as she spoke in carefully measured tones to the press. He saw the doubt creeping in, the way she second-guessed herself, as if she had failed, as if she had let this happen. And without hesitation, he stepped in. He reached out to every contact he had, lawyers, journalists, former colleagues. He demanded investigations, exposed the lies, fought tooth and nail to clear Clara's name. And more than that, he stood beside her. In every meeting, in every difficult conversation, he was there, his presence a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. And when it was over, when the truth came out and the damage was undone, Clara looked at him and realized she had never loved anyone more in her life. Because love wasn't just in the grand gestures, in whispered confessions or stolen kisses. It was in this, in standing beside someone when they needed you most, in believing in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. That night, as they stood on the rooftop of the community center, looking out over the city, Daniel finally found the courage to say what had been sitting on his heart for months. He turned to her, his voice quiet, but sure. "Clara, I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was the first time I read your letter. Maybe it was the 100th time I saw you fighting for people who had no one else to fight for them. But I see you. And I don't want to just work with you. I want to be with you." She inhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath for far too long. And then she smiled, the kind of smile that made the whole world feel lighter. "Daniel," she whispered, "you already are." Clara's answer wasn't just a word. It was a promise, a quiet certainty that settled between them like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel didn't need her to say anything more. In that moment, he knew, with more clarity than he had ever known anything in his life, that he had found something far greater than the treasure buried beneath his grandfather's grave. He had found her. The months that followed passed in a blur of planning and quiet moments stolen in between their work. Neither of them cared for extravagance. Their lives had never been about grand displays, and their love was no different. The wedding wouldn't be a spectacle, but rather a reflection of everything they had built together, warm, intimate, filled with the people whose lives had intertwined with theirs in ways neither of them could have predicted. When the day finally arrived, the sun hung high in a sky so blue it felt almost unreal. The ceremony took place in the heart of the community center, the very place where Daniel had first seen Clara not as a name on a letter, but as a woman who had dedicated her life to something greater than herself. It wasn't a cathedral, wasn't lined with gold or adorned with lavish decorations. But to Daniel, it was perfect. The guests weren't dignitaries or society's elite. They were the people who had been touched by their work. The children who had once known hunger but now sat with full bellies and bright eyes. The mothers who had found shelter. The elderly who had once been forgotten but now sat in the front row, their hands clasped together as they watched with misted eyes. A little girl, one Daniel remembered from the night he had first understood the power of giving, clutched a basket of flowers in her small hands, scattering petals down the aisle with the careful precision of someone who understood she was part of something special. The scent of fresh roses mixed with the faint aroma of baked bread drifting from the kitchen where volunteers had been preparing food for the reception since dawn. And then, Clara. She walked toward him, not in a designer gown, not adorned in diamonds, but simply as herself, elegant in a dress that moved like a whisper around her hair pinned loosely at the back, as if she had barely given it a second thought. But her eyes held a kind of light that made Daniel forget to breathe for a moment. When she reached him, they stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle around them. Daniel took her hands in his fingers warm against her skin. "This isn't just a promise," he said softly. "It's a vow, not just to love you, but to stand beside you, to keep building something bigger than ourselves, to keep giving, no matter what." Clara's voice was steady when she spoke, but her eyes shimmered. "We started this journey alone, Daniel. But we're not alone anymore, and we never will be again." The officiant's words were gentle, but neither of them truly heard them. The vows had already been spoken, long before today, in the way Daniel had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, in the way Clara had shown him that giving wasn't just about money, but about presence. And when he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, when she did the same for him, it wasn't just a ceremony. It was the beginning of something neither of them had ever truly had before. Home. As they turned to face the people who had become their family, the room erupted in applause, but Daniel barely heard it. His world had narrowed to Clara's hand in his, the quiet press of her fingers against his palm, the knowledge that from this day forward they would walk the same path, side by side. The reception wasn't filled with expensive champagne or extravagant decorations. Instead, it was filled with laughter, with music played by a band of local musicians, with the sound of children giggling as they danced in circles, with the scent of home-cooked meals prepared by the very people their foundation had helped over the years. At one point in the evening, as Daniel stood at the edge of the room watching Clara talk to a group of volunteers, he felt a familiar presence beside him. An elderly woman with kind eyes, her hands clasped in front of her, a knowing smile on her lips, She would be proud of you, you know." Daniel turned, his chest tightening at the sight of Martha, the woman who had given him his grandmother's letter all those months ago. His voice was quiet. "I hope so." Martha nodded, looking toward Clara. "She left you the treasure, Daniel. But I think we both know now. This was the real gift." Daniel exhaled, a slow, steady breath. He had spent so much of his life searching for purpose, searching for belonging, searching for something to hold on to. And in the end, it had been here all along. Not in wealth, not in possessions, but in people. As the night stretched on, he felt Clara's hand slip into his once more. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and together they watched as the people they had come to love celebrated not just their union, but the life they had chosen to build. And as they stood there, surrounded by warmth, by love, by the quiet knowledge that they had found something truly rare, Daniel knew without a doubt that they had found something far greater than fortune. They had found meaning, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Daniel's journey is more than just a story of unexpected fortune. It is a profound exploration of purpose, generosity, and the true meaning of wealth. What begins as a mystery surrounding a hidden treasure transforms into a life-changing revelation, one that teaches Daniel that real riches are not found in material possessions, but in the lives we touch. At first, Daniel struggles with the weight of his inheritance, torn between personal gain and the responsibility left to him by his grandmother. However, as he chooses to give rather than hoard, he discovers that money is only valuable when used to uplift others. Through acts of kindness, he not only changes the lives of those in need, but also finds himself transformed. His connection with Clara further solidifies this truth, showing that love and companionship are just as vital as philanthropy. The story delivers a timeless lesson. True wealth is measured not by what we keep, but by what we share. It reminds us that purpose is found in service and fulfillment is born from compassion. In the end, Daniel doesn't just find love, he finds meaning, proving that the greatest treasures in life are often the ones we least expect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.